When I woke up this morning, I had heavy on my mind and heart Velma Hall. Some of you remember Velma. She's been gone from us for a couple of years now. She used to love on Easter morning going into the foyer and saying, "He is risen," and hoping that you would say back to her, "He is risen indeed," the ancient Christian formula. The problem was everybody didn't know this. And so it was often very awkward because she would walk up to people and say, "He is risen." And they would say, yeah. I want to keep that alive in the church, keep that memory alive. And so I invite you to join with me. He is risen. I'm going to do something in this Easter sermon that I've never done, even though I've been preaching Easter sermons for over 20 years now. I'm going to open by talking about zombies. You're welcome. I did a little research on zombies this past week and discovered something that was discouraging to me. I discovered that I am actually older than zombies. Zombies, I thought, were something far more ancient than they are. The first zombie movie ever was 1968. I was born in 67, so I don't remember the movie. I still haven't seen it. It was called Night of the Living Dead, and George A. Romero is the man who made the movie. And he says in an interview that he made the movie because he had become disillusioned with the modern culture. He also said that he thought the 60s had great potential, but then he thought the 60s failed in that potential, and that was his response. The first ever zombie movie. Now, he borrowed the term from Haitian voodoo culture. A zombie was just a sorcerer's slave, and then he changed the concept of zombie into that flesh-eating, wandering, mindless creature that you may be familiar with if you watch zombie movies at all. I don't know if you do. There was something actually prescient in his movie. It was released the same year that Martin Luther King Jr. was killed. And what made that interesting is he had a black hero in the movie. A black hero in a movie, mainstream movie back then, was a rarity. I think he tapped into something when he started zombie movies. Now, I kind of hesitate to say that because this is an Easter sermon, but at the same time, I've watched, especially in the past, 10 or 15 years, I've watched as zombie movies have kept coming at us. Every time I think the zombies are dead, or the movies are dead, they get up and they keep shuffling toward us. So many different zombie movies. I didn't grow up a zombie fan at all. I think the first time I ever watched any flick like that was 28 Days Later, the movie, which I found fascinating. And then I saw one that was meant to be a comedy. By the way, they have so many different versions of zombies, you know. They're not just one thing, in case you're wondering. There's one movie that is a romantic comedy zombie movie, and that class is now called rom-com zom. So, just so you know. The movie, comedy zombie movie, Shaun of the Dead, I don't know if you saw that. When I saw that movie, I noticed something in there that I hadn't noticed before, that there was real cultural critique in this movie. That they're actually saying something about the world in which we live. Now, that doesn't mean I think zombies are real, just to be clear, but something about those movies is clicking with modern culture. In fact, just 2 weeks ago, I think, is the most recent release of a new series on Netflix about zombies. They just keep coming. And I believe it's because they've touched a nerve in our culture. I'm not the only one. There are plenty of people who write about this, so I'm not as strange as I sound right now. My personal theory is that people are feeling less and less alive. That they feel like they're going through the motions. They feel like they're just going through life with groans, consuming whatever is in front of them, without meaning, without purpose, and without hope. Feel free to disagree with my theory, but I see it in so many ways in the world around us. That people are wondering what it's all for. You've heard people say the world's going to hell in a handbasket more times than you know. And that's an expression of that belief that we have, whether we've examined it or not, that everything is going downhill, that it's getting worse all the time. There's a story about the Beatles writing songs, and that the reason John Lennon and Paul McCartney wrote so well together is that they were so different in nature. And so one time, Paul McCartney said, "It's getting better all the time." And John Lennon said, "It couldn't get much worse." There are different visions at work in the world. Different visions at work. And so no matter where you are in the culture, you can see this happening, whether we're worried about global climate change and the whole world falling apart, or whether we're worried about the decline of traditional values, or the decline of modern Western culture, or fill in the blank social issue, or just personal trauma you've been through. There is a sense that we all get, if we're not careful, that we've probably bought into, whether we realize it or not, that it's all going downhill. Entropy and death. I don't know if they did this in your elementary school, but they told us the sun someday would blow up and we would all die, which is a great thing to tell kids in an elementary classroom. But that's the way the universe works when we look at one certain vision of the world. I don't know what your week was like. Maybe you had a traumatic week and you understand that really well. I know my week was pretty hard. I'm wearing this suit for the third time this morning. I haven't worn a suit in a while, but I had to go to Indiana to do a funeral for my uncle on Good Friday, and then graveside yesterday, and then break it out again today. Some weeks are harder than others. Maybe you've had a whole series of bad weeks. Maybe you've had a season of difficult years. Maybe you have bought into the belief that it's all going downhill, because that stuff is bubbling underneath our vision all the time. You hear it in our songs. You see it in the art that is dark and focused on death. You see it on car commercials where they try to make you think that if you just buy a niftier car, you will suddenly experience some joy, because there's no other way to get joy in this life than to temporarily get something. It's in the air we breathe. Order to disorder. Life to lifelessness. That's why I love this vision from Ezekiel that you heard this morning. This vision from Ezekiel, the valley of the dry bones that Linda read just a little bit ago, about the reanimation of the bones and the breath of the Spirit of God coming into those beings. When I was reading that, working on the sermon, that's when I realized, this vision from Ezekiel, it's a reverse zombie movie. It's a backward vision from what the world believes. And it's a vision that's all the way through Scripture, if you care to see it there, that sees the world differently than the world that we've come to expect. Just a little background on Ezekiel. He was writing and living 2,500 years ago. This isn't a new vision by any means. And he was raised in Jerusalem to be a priest. That was his purpose. That was his meaning. That was the thing toward which he was pointed. But it all got taken away from him when the Babylonians came to Jerusalem, laid siege to the city, threatened to kill everyone and destroy the whole thing. And the king of Judah offered what he could to pay off the king of Babylon so that he wouldn't destroy the city and would let them continue to live. And it worked. But here's the problem that happened around it. When the Babylonians left, they didn't just leave them there like that. They took with them the best and the brightest of the city of Jerusalem, because that's what the Babylonians did. They had learned very smartly that if you pull the leaders out of a city, that city will keep going, but it won't be strong enough to rise up and rebel against you. And so they did what we call in the modern Western world, we kind of call it brain drain when people leave areas, because they did brain drain on Jerusalem, which I only mention because it works nicely with zombies, doesn't it? They turned Jerusalem into a being that existed but wouldn't thrive. And Ezekiel, as he turns 30 years old, which is the age at which you became a priest, is sitting on the shores of a drainage canal in Babylon, and he's losing hope, because the only thing he was made to do was to be a priest in the temple, and now he's a priest without a temple, and he has no purpose. In fact, maybe he's had a little hope that someday they would be able to go back and occupy the temple and have their homeland again, and that maybe that would work well. But then he gets word that the Babylonians have now destroyed the temple and the wall, and Jerusalem is in desolation. And he has a vision that is the nail in the coffin. He sees in the vision the glory of God rise up out of the temple in Israel in spectacular fashion and abandon the temple, as if God is saying, I am done with you. He's lost all hope. You've been there, haven't you? Maybe not at the level of being deported and having loved ones you know killed and laying in the streets, but you've been to that spot. I've had this recurring dream. It's a stress dream where I'm up on a balcony. It's a very high place always. It's not always a balcony, but it's a high platform of some kind in every situation, but there's no railing. And I'm in charge of 4 or 5 kids, trying to keep them in that spot. And I can't do it. Everything I try isn't working. And there's this spot in the dream, and it's horrifying every time, where a baby, bloop, goes over the edge. And I always think in the dream, should I jump and try to catch? But that won't help the baby, and that won't help the people. And all I can do is stay on the platform and try to protect what's left. It's a horrible, horrible dream. I don't recommend it. But now that I've shared it, maybe you can have that dream and I won't have it anymore. Multiply that. Ezekiel's homeland and people are gone. He has no hope. And then he gets this vision where God takes him in this vision to where he sees a valley of dry bones, and it looks like an army has been slaughtered, but long ago, because all the flesh is gone, the bones are bleached dry and white, and he walks among the bones, probably in horror at the fact that he's walking through such a slaughter. And God says to him, man, can these bones live again? Ezekiel says, the very best thing, Lord, you know. I don't know, you know. You tell me. And God says, I want you to prophesy to these bones so that they will live again. And in the process of prophesying to them, the bones begin rattling, and they come together, I presume to look like skeleton bones joined to bone, and sinews are formed over the bones, and then flesh appears on the sinews, and then skin covers the flesh, and they're still just lying in the valley dead. Until God says to Ezekiel, now, prophesy to the Spirit of God, to the wind of God, the breath of God. It's the same word for all of those in Hebrew. Prophesy to the Spirit of God, and they will live again. And so he does it, and the Spirit of God fills those bodies, and they stand up again, and God interprets the vision for Ezekiel and says, here's what you tell Israel, Ezekiel. Tell them that they will stand again in their homeland, and I am still with them, and I am not done with them. And you will know that this is true, he says, when I empty the graves. It's a bizarre vision. You should know that the book of Ezekiel, this may go without saying, but I'll say it anyway. When Ezekiel wrote it, it wasn't in the Old Testament yet. Does that make sense? He wrote it, and it was just a book. And they had to decide at some point, is this book, does it belong in our sacred writings or not? And Ezekiel was one that was about to be left out because it is so strange and gruesome and weird and hard to understand. And it gives me great joy to know that even the people in that day had a hard time understanding it. And there's tales of a man named Hananiah ben Hezekiah who takes 300 barrels of oil and goes into his room, and the oil is for his lamp, and he decides, I'm not coming out until I understand this book of Ezekiel. And he does it and works at it because he saw something in it. And what he saw is that Ezekiel wrote that long ago while we were in Babylon and while we were in exile. And he said we would stand again in our home. And here we are. Against all odds, by the way. The Babylonians were not going to let Israel go back, but shall we say miraculously, the Persians overwhelmed the Babylonians and became the ones in charge. And the Persians just said to the Jews, you can go back and rebuild your temple and rebuild your walls. And there they were, back in their homeland against all odds. And you know that Hananiah ben Hezekiah read this and said, something's very true here. But what he had trouble figuring out were a myriad of things, but one of them is, I will empty your graves, and then you will know that I have done it. That story, that vision of reality makes no sense in the world in which we live once we've embraced the story of decay. That's the vision of reality that the women had when they went to the tomb. When Jesus, who after the Jews came back to the temple and occupied their homeland again and stood on their own soil again, they raised up a young man named Jesus of Nazareth, who was the one who would become the light to the nations that God always promised the Jews they would be. And he was put to death on a Roman cross, put in a grave, and we all know that graves stay full. And so the women come on that first Easter morning with spices to anoint the body, because this is how the world works. Just this. It's why they're shocked. They're shocked when they get there. They're shocked when they get there and the grave is open and empty. They're so shocked they don't know what to do about it or say. They run back to the disciples who had followed Jesus, but who still believed in just the narrative of death and decay. And they say to them, the grave is empty. And Peter thinks they're just telling idle tales. And Peter runs to the tomb and sees that it's empty. And he still doesn't believe it because they've all bought into a vision of life that ends with death. But in that moment, a new story is written. A new narrative is made true. And those disciples and those followers of Jesus in those first days after his resurrection and then his ascension finally believed that there was a new story at work, and they were people without money, without education, and yet they could not be stopped because they had seen a different vision of reality, and they went into all the world at great cost, physical harm and death, to proclaim that there's a new vision and it doesn't end in death. It's a new story at work. I know it's hard to believe. I know that we see so much death that we could start thinking that that's all there is decay. All there is an end with nothing. But this story is a little like the zombies. because it keeps going. Every generation, it is declared dead. In the days of the Soviet Union did everything they could to undermine this narrative, and the church didn't die, and the message didn't die. The Chinese are doing everything they can to undermine the narrative right now. It is growing in China. In the Western culture, we don't get undermined in this story by an official move. It's just that general, just go and consume mindlessly because this is all there is, that tries to undermine this message in our culture, and it's still not dead. In Sri Lanka this morning at Easter services, bombs went off. Over 200 are now dead, 400 injured, and they chose this morning for a reason. They want to kill this narrative. But it's not going to die because it's a part of a different story than that. It's a part of the story where God pours out life, eternal and abundant, and no matter how much you try to kill the gospel, it just gets back up. Amen. Because God has written a new story. And God, just like with the bones in Ezekiel, God has breathed God's Spirit into you, and you cannot be stopped. Because you have life abundant and eternal. Shall we pray?